There's that voice. They could make the voice a little more pleasant. Like it's
It's a
2020.
white box that comes up for us.
Mm,
It's a white box right in the center of the screen, and you have to press the button that says "Got it," because the text says you're being recorded, and you have to
yeah,
accept that before the box will go away. So
that makes sense because you don't
it's
want
not
to.
just that voice.
Yeah, you don't want to be
She's
secret.
all right. I think Siri is much more annoying.
I don't use Siri, so I don't know. I don't hear it
I
very.
don't have her either. The woman in my car is annoying. I don't like her. I
Mm.
want to choose the voice.
You can in some like driving apps, you can choose like a British voice. That's always fun.
I want a voice, but I know who I want.
Oh,
I want Hank Azaria. Hank Azaria was
mm,
married to Helen Hunt. He did all the voices of The Simpsons, and he does a lot of voices, but he's also an actor. And he was the manservant in A Birdcage, the movie, The Birdcage with Robin Williams and um, it's hilarious. It's a hilarious movie. And he was a Hispanic, gay, barefoot, wait, and he couldn't do anything. He didn't know how to do anything, but he was their maid. And he talked with a thick Spanish accent, but as a gay man, it was hilarious. It was the best accent ever. It was his best voice, my favorite. And that's who I want in my car telling me where to go. No, 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 I told you to make a left. Like that's what I want. I want a hysterical voice, but I can't get everything I want apparently.
apparently. I'm glad I don't drive.
Imagination.
All right, so we'll just do a quick review. This is the third week. So first week we had the human imbalance. I had fun talking about this yesterday with Bob because one of the things that I don't know if it's really an addition. I like Liam Neeson too. Yeah, I could do Liam Neeson, but yeah, I don't think it matters. Just as long as it's not too annoying. And the driving voices have been updated. So they sound almost like normal people. It's when they sound too robotic. I don't like that. When you can just tell clearly it's not a person. Um, but we started with the human imbalance. And so the human imbalance is something that I have never really heard. I have never really heard that from anyone else, that the overall volume, the overall amount of thought is one of the fundamental imbalances in the human experience. And it really boggles my mind. I was just reading about the seven or the eight limbs of yoga, eight, seven, I don't know. But um, it, again, it just seems to gloss over how much thought is influencing everything. So it mentions thoughts being, one way or another, but it still doesn't mention that the overall amount, the pure amount of thinking is grossly imbalanced. And I don't know, I guess that has somehow been missed. Other things that I don't really prefer about that type of writing is it goes from one extreme to another again. It has images of perfection, ultimate reality, real versus illusion, and now we want to be able to sit in realness, and it's like, here we go again. This is just literally all the same shit. um, it's not, I mean, it's not bad. I don't dislike it per se, but I see certain continuous flaws throughout history. The competition between theories, this idea of going from one extreme to the other, and eventually it talks about just no thought whatsoever. So somehow they arrive at the human being should never think if they expect to have enlightenment. And of course, enlightenment is this the way that it's written, it just seems like it's this mystical destination. And I can't really get down with any of that. So interesting reading. I know for a certain, uh, in certain settings, you need to know some of this information, like if you're teaching yoga or you're in a yoga studio, but outside of that, it doesn't have a lot of value for me personally. It's interesting, but I see that continuous error of going from one extreme to the other, images of perfection, getting there, it doesn't seem to reside in balance, that we're trying to find a balance between what we view as contextual opposites. And to find a balance, we have to embrace both to a certain extent. So the human imbalance, I kind of was talking with Bob yesterday that what I believe is the game changer for the human being and probably any species is first when they start to recognize themselves as separate. And again, union, yoga, yoke together, and then we get into we're all one, man. And I get that. We are all one, cool. I don't disagree. But yet everybody who says that, if they want to be in my presence, they have to travel. They probably should call first or something, let me know that they're coming. They're going to travel a distance. And so, yeah, we're all one, but we also have this island of the practical where there is actual distance, at least right now. Maybe someday you'll just be able to molecularize right in front of me and that will be cool. But until then, we have this thing that we call distance, time, space. So finding a balance between these two by learning to embrace both. But when a lot of animals, I don't know, all animals, but when they look in a mirror, they don't look at the image as a reflection of themselves. So one thing that I think the human brain did at one point is it was able to see itself in its environment, separate from everything. Also whole, I get it, but also separate. It's individuality. And then from that individuality came very likely at a certain point, and we see this in animals that seem to have a little bit more evolution behind them, that they have a concept of death. So not only did the human being realize that it has an individual aspect, and then of course it can find its place in the universe. We can see where we are in the scheme of things to a certain extent on the planet, potentially outside the planet. Depends on who is thinking about it or who is, pondering this. But then the human being was able to perceive death, and that death is an inevitability for everything that's living. And it creates a type of aspect to life that can create more value. It can be an inspiration to live because you know that everything is finite. And I think that had a lot to do with what I call the evolution of consciousness. Why did we begin to find a flower beautiful? Because we knew that we were going to die. We know that our place in the universe, and we started to take time for other things. So our brain evolved in a different way than it had up to that point. This is all hypothesis. This is just my way of saying this all adds up to me. It makes a lot of sense. Not something necessarily that I teach. The imbalance of thinking is something that I teach because that's in my face. Like that is an obvious thing to me. I've seen it. But when I back it up and I go back through human history, it's really just for fun because I loved my evolutionary biology classes. I know that evolution is directly proportional to the species adaptation to change. I know that finding a sunset beautiful or finding music interesting or finding something funny doesn't advance that cause necessarily. At least to a certain extent, it does not. It won't help me against a bear. It won't help me hunt and gather. In fact, it can be distracting. You're over here looking for a particular plant and you get lost in its beauty. And then before you know it, you didn't find the plant and, the village dies or starves or whatever. That's a bit dramatic. I don't know. Maybe they didn't get their medicine or something. But this isn't really. That's why I use the word hypothesis. It's not that serious, but I think it's an interesting point that relates to us today because
I think that you're right. But of course, it is hypothesis. It's sense of once you have a set sense of self that's separate, then the whole you start to interpret your instincts differently because it's now as a concept of self. So competition has the thought stream associated with it instead of I want to get to that food before somebody else gets to that food. Um, so the nurturing things also, and the community, like certain animals live in communities, they share, they make tools, they do things, the monkeys and stuff. But then the us and them, the territorial, another pack comes in, or all of that has thought related to it. Once you have a thought about yourself being separate, then there's a thought about everything else in relation to the self. So I guess death can be a part, survival and death can be a part of that, but it all stems from the concept of self. I think you're right.
Yeah.
That's
And
where
then
it,
and then death in relation to the end of the concept of self. And so that gives a person, maybe and this actually could predate thought, because it could technically predate language. So the way that I use the word thought, it's directly proportional to a language-based verbal cognition. And if at a certain point they hadn't invented the language yet, they hadn't actually started to put words or sounds to objects, then all of this could have allowed the mind to evolve. And the evolution of consciousness, I think, can exist independently from the evolution of the physical body. I don't think that they're, mutually dependent. Both will evolve over time, because that's what evolution is change over time. So the more time that something is given, the more opportunity it has to change, and it will evolve. So I look at that as a universal principle, that the tendency is towards evolution, or uh, change in a more complex way. It continues to get more diverse, more of more, if that makes sense. And that will actually lead a little bit into today's discussion. So that was the human imbalance. I have never really seen it anywhere. That's why some of this is I've seen in certain places, and I'll usually tell you where it originated from, like where the idea sparked from, whether it's Eckhart Tolle, whether it's Teak, whether it's Don Juan. I'll usually tell you where I got the idea from and then what I did with it. That's always the key. It's what did you do with, and that will also lend to today's conversation. Just four of us, so probably not going to be a lot of Q. Actually, no, Donna's here. There might be some good Q&A.
I think that sometimes you just can't trace it. It's interesting to know where it came from and what you did with it. But sometimes that takes some deconstruction and reconstruction to figure out, and it's not always essential, because the wisdom is what you've applied, everything you've learned up until this point, everything you've heard up until this point. Whether you can dissect where it came from and what you did with it isn't always.
Right.
I mean, it's valuable for these classes. I'm certainly interesting, but um, I don't know where I get what I get. I don't know if I read it somewhere, somebody else thought it. I don't know if I'm brilliant or I just have a good memory, and I don't remember where I remember it from. It doesn't matter.
I don't know. Maybe a combination of all those things.
Interesting to know that the longer you live, from what you said there, it takes time for something to evolve. So the longer you live, by the time you're 110 years old, Ernest, you'll have changed again and again and again. And
You know?
that's very, very interesting to someone like me who is watching another person change and evolve as they get older and seeing the dramatic changes that you couldn't really have imagined 20 or 30 years ago, that this person would speak like this or talk like this. I'm seeing that all around me now,
Yeah.
and it's quite amazing to watch. But to know that it's happening with me as well, to actually know that that allowing time to take that to make that process happen is valuable, to actually know it, and then you can watch it in yourself and in others.
True. Yeah.
And accept it. I'm sorry to interrupt, Ernest, but I found that with my nieces and nephews, and my nephew's 50 something. I mean, these aren't children, but they're having children, and they're experiencing things for the first time. And I am, believe it or not, less talkative as a result of this practice. And so they would say certain things to me, like I would take the baby and I just want to go inside and do that. And it's like, go. And, or I would say nothing and smile, and they would think I'm having judgment. And so I'm not speaking because I'm having judgment. And then they, like, explain themselves. Well, I think that it's, do you think I'm crazy? I'm overreacting. I'm being too. And I said, I think you're a wonderful mother. I think you're doing a wonderful job. And I would love to hold your child so you can go enjoy company that you haven't seen, or maybe go take a nap or something. I have no judgment. I'm not thinking anything. You don't owe me any explanation to why. You don't have to narrate to me why you're doing what you're doing. I love holding your child. And if you're good with that, go do. You don't have to explain yourself to me. I noticed so much how everybody's justifying their existence or their behavior or their, that Ida's reflection made me think of that. It's people are changing, and they want you to approve of them, and they want you to, they're questioning their existence and what they're doing and the value of it so much. They want everybody to be in agreement, and you don't need my agreement. You have my agreement. Whatever you decide is great. Like, I have no business deciding what you have to decide about how you mother or parent, or, everybody just relax. You don't need so many words.
Yeah, that's true. I've seen that quite a bit. And I mean, that will come up at a certain point in these 20 topics as well, things like that. One thing though that I would add to the evolution factor is adaptation. So the adaptation factor is what drives evolution or change over time. If you can't adapt, you won't be able to change over time. And so physically, that looks like, I don't know, a pandemic. And now all of a sudden you can't physically do the things that you're used to doing. If you're highly adaptable, you're going to figure it out. You're going to find a way to keep your body active if that's the case, or you're going to find a way to get some sunshine, get some air, keep moving, et cetera, et cetera. A mind that, or a physical body that's not adaptable to that situation. And of course it relates to the mind. And that will be getting towards the 20th topic, is the evolution of consciousness. The evolution of consciousness is directly proportional to the mind's ability to adapt to change. And you're seeing it, Ida, in people maybe that you didn't expect it. You're seeing it in yourself. And if you really watch closely, in order for any of that to occur, the mind has to be adaptable. Adaptability has to do with freedom to move. How free is it to move left or right or up or down? That is physical, and it can also be psychological. And so if you see a mind that isn't free to move, that mind won't change as much over time. So they'll be 60, and then they'll be 70, and then they'll be 80, and they'll still be clinging to ideas and opinions and words that have been going through their mind for decades and decades and decades. And there's a lot of minds like that. So every mind to some extent is still changing over time, but some are changing at a different rate because they're more adaptable, they're more free to move. In a psychological sense, that means not clinging and attaching to ideas. It means not rushing to judgments. A lot of it could be considered critical thinking, the ability to look at something objectively, suspend final judgment, and just see a more complete picture. And when you do that, you see that there's a lot of different sides to even one topic, that there's so many different dimensions and ways to look at it. And I think that adaptability over time will really compound. And the more the mind is free to move, then the more the evolution, you could make it like a chart. It's going to curve up as opposed to more of a flat line that's just barely going up. And for some people, it's not going up at all. It could even be going down. That's just the way it is. But the adaptation and the evolution is directly proportional to freedom of movement. Physically, the more your body is free to move, the more that you can change your physical shape to adapt to the physical environment, whether that's jumping out of the way of a car or learning different ways to move. Like I do Portal, if you've ever seen him, he is not a common human being in terms of his physicality and what he can do with it. And then psychologically, still freedom to move. How free are we to move and to change? If we cling, attach, get angry, we go back to patterns and habits, we're not as free to move. That mind over 30 or 40 years may still change a little bit, maybe change their mind. There's some catalysts maybe that they just can't ignore or whatever. So there is a degree, there is kind of a scale. So our goal, which is kind of a goalless goal, because we don't ever have to focus on it once. It will just be a thing that occurs as we get through this practice and we get to these 20 topics, is that our mind will be very free to move. What are one of the things that's keeping it from mobility? Thought, constant, repetitive, habitual thought that leads to constant, repetitive, habitual action. And before you know it, you hear the most wild, far-fetched idea, and you cling to that as truth instantly. That's a conspiracy theory mindset. And the thing about it is that usually there are little kernels of possibility in there somewhere, you know? It's like, oh, here's a kernel of possibility. Well, I watched this YouTube video and now I know it all. You know, that is actually a type of pattern that mind very likely gets into, and it's not always a beneficial pattern.
I think it's also a pattern, part of the pattern that I was just thinking about how stuck I was about moving. When do I retire? When do I move? I can't. You know, my 401k, is that going to be what? When can I collect Social Security? Like, well, if I'm going to go, where am I going to go? It's just going to be a lateral movement. I won't be saving money. Same, habitual, repetitive, over and over and over. And when I finally just said, let it go, but just go be happy at work, and then like, then the path or a path will be open, and then you'll decide. You're just going to have to decide something. There's no magic thing that's going to happen. You're just going to have to decide. And so once I stopped doing that, I just decided. But I think the conspiracy theory thing, I think when you think you are stuck, you can't control this, and these people are controlling that, and you have these habitual repetitive thoughts that are making you feel unwell, you really feel unwell because you're thinking, the more you, when you said that the adaptation and the evolution is directly related to the freedom of movement, I wrote it down. The lack of freedom of movement has a feeling, and it's an awful feeling, and it feels like you have no control, and that, you know, your decision making is out of, you don't have any freedom of movement, and it feels terrible. You feel like a caged animal, like you're a victim of something, and it's your own thoughts you're a victim of, but that's not what you think. You're blaming everything outside of you. So when there's a conspiracy theory that is equal to the level of crazy that you're feeling, and the level of persecution and victimization that you're feeling, then you go, that must be it. You know, that resonates with me, with the way that I'm feeling, that these crazy people are doing horrible things, because that matches the amount of horrible that I'm feeling. And I think that's a reason why it's easier for somebody like that to cling. That's how it becomes easy to recruit people into terrorist groups and things like that, because they're fighting against some big ugly thing that matches the degree of big and ugly that they feel.
Yeah, there's a topic that's so important to me that it's the topic of one of my books. And it, you know, I'm pretty sure I'll use the term somewhere in there, but naive realism. It's a term that I learned in psychology, but it is the incessant tendency to assume that your point of view and perspective is the only true and correct one. And
Oh,
that
and I've lived it, so
also,
I know it. I mean,
yeah,
I can see it on to a larger degree in the crazies, you know, because I've done some degree of it myself. So, you know, when Ida was saying she can see people changing in ways that she couldn't have imagined, and then that makes her reflect on, well, that's because I'm changing too. I mean, you couldn't even have the perspective to notice it if you hadn't allowed this, if you didn't have the space to see it.
yeah, and you can see the principle of freedom to move or lack thereof in naive realism. Naive realism isn't free to move. You're stuck. This is your mind, your idea, you're correct. And the name of that book is Everybody's Stupid But You. So, and there's a reason that, I'll talk about how I got through stuff like that, because I grew up in that environment. You can't tell my brothers anything. They are, I don't know why they're not presidents and heads of state, because they know everything. So I can't understand where are their degrees
Oh,
from.
I know. I have a girlfriend that calls me once, we don't see each other all the time. She goes, how's everything? And I go, ugh. She goes, what's the matter? I go, oh, everybody's an asshole. And she goes, oh, I hate it when that happens. And we both laugh because we know what it is. It's you. If everybody is an asshole, then you gotta fix something in your head.
It's a good point. Yeah. Everybody is an asshole but you. Okay, so the imbalance of human thinking was our first topic. It is the cause of the human condition. And weirdly enough, I've never really heard that echoed anywhere. I don't know why. The nemesis was topic 2. And so recall that the nemesis is, it's like a force. It's something that the human being has created. And sometimes we look at things and you're like, what do you mean by force? Is it like wind? Is it like gravity? It's a psychological force that the human being has created, and it gains momentum. It starts to feel more solid, more, in air quotes, real and tangible. But the nemesis is the mind that is operating below the level of active recognition. So our human body is taking in sensory perception. So we're perceiving above and below the level of recognition at all times. Recognition is when your mind is using attention, its ability to isolate aspects of the available data, and it's processing it. So recognition is a form of cognitive processing. When you're born, you can't really recognize anything because you have no context of reference. And so you don't really remember any of it either. Infantile memory syndrome, I think they call it. So that has to do more with memory and contextual reference. So the nemesis is a mind that is operating below the level of recognition. And the number one thing that pulls the mind below the level of recognition, drum roll please, is thinking. Typically, thinking is going to be either future or past. Very rarely is a person thinking about the present, and when they are, typically there's a lot of judgment involved. Does that make sense? So we're feeding this thing that I call the nemesis whenever we're engaged in the first enemy of knowledge. I've introduced that, which is distraction. So if we're distracted, what are we doing? Typically, we're lost in some sort of thought. I like how Don Juan continues to word the affairs of everyday life, the things that we think are just so darn important. That's the opposite of dream walking, by the way. And we'll talk more about that later, of course. But so the nemesis is what feeds the destroyers, because if we're below the level of active recognition, we're easily malleable, we're easily manipulated, we're more easy to come to conclusions that aren't free to move, like we were just discussing earlier. We're more likely to get stuck in habitual patterns. Those patterns will gain momentum. They'll get deeper and deeper and will lend to other patterns that get deeper and deeper quicker than if they weren't like chained reacted patterns. So it's easier to create new patterns of a similar pattern. And that's all due to the nemesis. So because of thought, the human being is very often falling below the level of recognition of the present moment. Does that make sense? They're still looking at the TV below the level of recognition. They're still talking to somebody below the level of active recognition, because there's a lot of habit and thinking and comparing and contrasting. You'd be surprised if you could really reach into someone's brain while you're talking to them, how often they're talking to themselves too. It's like, well, what are you doing? Who's talking here, you or me? So active listening, we have to have a word for that. We have to have phrases for active listening. to imply that I'm going to suspend my internal self-talk long enough to listen, because I can only play words in my mind to a certain extent before I can't take any more words. Does that make sense? And when you're thinking, you're paying attention to it. And that's one of the reasons that it makes us dumb, deaf, and blind to the world around us. And that's the nemesis. The nemesis feeds the destroyers. We'll talk about the destroyers later. And I never really talk about interacting directly with the destroyers until we get into hunting power. But even then, it's still just focusing more so on the nemesis. Where is my mind, and am I above or below the level of recognition? If I'm above the level of recognition, then there's a few things that I can do to help me with my intention and will, which is lends to what I call personal power. And I can explain personal power, but it's that chart of, or it's not a chart, it's like a person, and you have the above and the below, and the more their mind is relaxed and present, the more their body is relaxed, the more that energy will flow through them as a conduit. So that's echoed throughout cultures separated by space and time, that the human being is a conduit for energy. And we know that, at least to a certain extent, that the human body is very electrical. We know that with the heart, that the heart is an electrical thing. We use electricity to get it started again, or a jolt of some sort, a vibrational pounding to get the heart to spark again. So we know that and then we call it electrochemical, because that's, nerves, electrical signals going up the spine to the brain. So we are electrical, which is energy. We're physical, which is atoms. And then we have our mind and everything else. So the nemesis is very pervasive. It is huge in the world right now. And that lends to the fifth destroyer, which is the collective momentum, which it is so in the minds of the people that it is like a force that we have created. It is something that, no, it's not as tangible as this pen, but then again, you can look around and see it everywhere, see the results of it everywhere. Does that make sense? The nemesis? All right, so the human imbalance of thinking leads to the nemesis. And so today we're going to differentiate knowledge, intelligence, and wisdom. So this will seem a little bit like review, but I spoke about this with Bob yesterday. We were just chit-chatting because he had a little extra time. In the world today, we use words so interchangeably that they are mushy. They really mean nothing. Because I have to get 2 hours of background to know what this person's talking about when they're using particular words, because they're just being thrown all over the place. Does that make sense? Usually knowledge, wisdom, and intelligence can be used interchangeably, and I see an error in that. Does that make sense? Okay, that sounds good, Ida. All right, so I'll use my whiteboard here for a second. I have broken knowledge down into 3 parts, and then intelligence and wisdom are kind of their own thing. Knowledge consists of 3 parts, and this is for definition's sake, so that when I use these words, when we use these words in this system, they will be more clearly defined, and we won't be using the words interchangeably because they have different meanings. So knowledge, as I use the word, has 3 primary parts. 1, information. 2, and 2 and 3 are kind of the same thing, but they can have a slightly different complexion. It's experience, but I break it down into secondhand experience. And the most important, of course, depending on the situation, is firsthand experience. Because secondhand experience also kind of requires a little bit of trust. Like, how do I know that Donna really burnt her hand on that pan just because it was red hot? Like, I don't know. I guess I trust her, so okay. So sometimes secondhand experience does require a little bit of trust factor. That's why in many cases, firsthand experience can be more beneficial. Then again, I don't need to touch that red hot pan. So in that case, it's not as beneficial. So in our world today, we get really hung up on information, and it becomes an enemy of knowledge. It's, I think, the third. Ignorance is the second, and then information itself can become an enemy of knowledge because it just accumulates. It accumulates and it accumulates, and before you know it, you're a conspiracy theorist because you're over indulged in raw information. So that looks a lot like reading books and going to webinars and going to events and going to retreats and learning yoga and learning, qigong and doing all of these things and not really seeing a whole lot of benefit from it. You're not really seeing that much from it as you potentially could. And that's all over the internet. Like every meme I read is usually not offering any type of technique whatsoever. We're all one, man. And it's like, okay, now what the hell can I do with that
It's
that would
also,
make any
I
difference?
think that if we have that mindset, and I know William and Jean have talked about it more than the rest of us, but it's the fact that if there's a problem, or if I see everything as a problem, the way to navigate is to get as much information as possible. And that becomes a loop. I just need a little more information, then I'll make a better decision. If I get some more information, then I'll make a better decision. And I need some more information so I can make the best decision. And it's just becomes an information overload that has nothing to do with just make a decision and adapt to whatever your decision is and move forward. It's the freedom of movement again gets overloaded by, the quest for more information about something.
Right. So if I said that somebody was smart, it just means they have a lot of information. And that's okay. But there is a point where, especially certain types of information, it just becomes disadvantageous because there's just too much. And some of it will start to compete. And then before you know it, you're throwing your arms up in the air because you just don't know what's what. Nothing is very clear to you. So,
Well, that's why you need these three definitions, because what are we talking about? What is smart? What is intelligence? What is knowledge? Let's
right.
all get on the same page, or we're not communicating really.
Absolutely. Yeah. And when I say these words, I mean them differently. I will not use these words interchangeably. So if somebody has a lot of information, I will not say that they're intelligent. Not necessarily. Their atoms are, but they may not be as a whole. It just depends. So knowledge, that first element of knowledge being information, it's still important. And that's why I started outside of historical fiction, because that's just historical fiction for me is entertainment. I enjoy it. I like reading those types of books. I like the history. I like the way that in order to create the history, they have to be very descriptive. So typically it's very descriptive type of writing that I enjoy, but I'm not seeking information, if that makes sense. When I do seek it, I don't really seek information, but I reread books. So that's been my thing now for quite a few years, 10, 11, I don't even know. So I reread books that had value to me because they continue to deliver more and more and more because I'm changing. So I find that to be more beneficial than just reading every fucking book under the sun, trying to make sense out of it. Especially information books that are trying to tell you what's what about the world. And 9 times out of 10, if not more than that, when I read something, it's almost never offering a technique or something that a person can actually do to lend to action. So we have information, but what about personal experience? What about the experiences of other people? That can sometimes be embedded in the information, and then that can give you something to work with, right? Because the experience of you guys have been using the experience of me and of other people in your practice potentially. Maybe I tell you how good my note card works, or how much an object of power, or having somebody remind me, or writing on walls, redirecting 1,000 times in a day. You can use that information of personal experience to add it to your own experience bank. Does that make sense? And then when there's balance between information and experience, then we can use it. We're more likely to remember it because memory plays a huge role in absolutely every single thing that we do, period. Sense of self relies on memory. Okay, is that cool? So wisdom, I'll jump to wisdom from knowledge, is the application of what we know. And that's what's sorely missing. Now, the reason that I have these words separated is because they're different. They have a different function. And some people will disagree. They'll be like, no, 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 wisdom is from the Lord. And I'll be like, that's cool. And when you talk about it, I'll know what you're saying. That's not how I use the word. So if you have a different word you'd like me to use, that is the application, remembering what you've learned, then let me know and I'll use that word and we can communicate. But the word that I use is wisdom. So I guess I always use the example of crossing the street. I know I have that information. Donna told me once that she didn't do it and she got hit by a car. And here I am about to cross the street. Am I going to remember what I've learned, the information and the experience from Donna, or am I just going to feed the nemesis and walk straight through that intersection without checking, potentially getting hit by a car? And if I get hit by a car, I may never forget again. But then again, I just got hit by a car. So it's not necessarily the best way to learn. You may still learn, and then some people still don't. They'll go to the hospital for this, that, or the other thing, and they'll say, okay, you're eating too much red meat. That's causing all your problems. So they have the information, they have the knowledge from other people, they have the experience from other people. They even have their own experience because it landed them in the hospital, and then they go out and they do the exact same behaviors. That's what habit will do. And that's not free to move. That's not going to lead to much evolution. That will actually lead to decay and death in the case of the red meat. Does that make sense? So when I apply the information and experience from other people that I call knowledge, that is wisdom. Wisdom is an expression. So based on this definition, can I share my wisdom? Not really. No, not really. I can share my experience and you can add that to your information bank, but I cannot give you wisdom because I can't make you remember. So I can share knowledge all day long. I can give you that. I can give a person some of my knowledge, things that I, in air quotes, know based on those three factors. There is nothing in the world other than me just tagging along behind you. But then again, that's not your wisdom, that's me. If I'm like, hey, Karen, look both ways before crossing the street, I did that, not you. You didn't rely on your own memory. So I mean, I don't know what that would be other than babysitting, following someone around and warning them about traffic. So wisdom, the way that I use the word, is non-transferable. Your wisdom is your ability to remember what you've learned. I will never do that for you. And it's also a form of information.
This process,
Mhm.
this class, this practice is just the techniques to give you space in your mind to exercise your own wisdom.
Yes. Yeah. Wisdom
I
is
just want to make words for it, just trying to make words for it.
yeah, no, wisdom is absolutely an individual affair. It has to do with you and you.
You can't share your wisdom, but you can share the techniques that give you the space to allow your wisdom
Information.
to adapt. Yeah.
Yep, I can share all that information. Technique is a type of information. And if I've used a technique, then I can give you an example, a personal experience of that technique. And I can say, well, Buddha did it too. And now you have Buddha's experience, my experience, and the information. And if it's vivid to you, if it is somehow sharp in your mind, or you have enough space created, you're more likely to remember. You're less likely to remember if you're feeding the nemesis. And that's the bottom line. The more you feed the nemesis below the level of recognition, the more you're going to act out a pattern. If you're not giving that pattern as much energy because you've created space in your mind, you're more likely to remember, just like remembering the keys or remembering an aha when you're not trying. Does that make sense? So wisdom and knowledge go hand in hand, and intelligence skips the process completely, potentially. Intelligence is the fabric of the universe. It's the reason it moves the way that it moves, which is highly geometrical. But intelligence is the reason that if you put brain cells in a petri dish, they'll start to organize. They'll start to do the same thing that the brain is doing, organizing, compartmentalizing, and it will lead to an evolution of some sort. Does that make sense? So the reason that your atoms are in angular momentum, they're in a constant rotation, the reason they move the way that they move, the reason we have a periodic table is the universe's fundamental intelligence. And intelligence will be well beyond our ability to understand where it came from because it's infinite. So it didn't really come from anywhere. It just is. And that boggles the mind to a certain extent, and I'll just leave you to it. So intelligence would be maybe having intelligence is felt. You can feel it like a knowing. It really coincides with that feeling of personal power. But intelligence would be something that never requires words. It doesn't even really always require your understanding or even your permission. It's going to do its thing on its own. So that's why sometimes when we say just get out of the way and allow the body's intelligence to do its thing and you'll heal, you'll get better. That's what we're talking about. So if somebody is really intelligent, you can give them a puzzle that they have no information on. They have no personal experience. They've never seen anybody do it before. They've never done anything like it. And yet they can solve it quickly because they're highly adaptable. Their mind is very clear, focused. That is intelligence. Well, if they're not focused, they're not going to be able to solve the puzzle.
I understand. There's just, you learn when you're becoming a teacher, the multiple intelligences, and we see them. There's some things that people are just born with a better ability to do. This 1.5-year-old has certain brain capabilities that are beyond some of the 4-year-olds in our family. It's just what she comes to the world with. She also has brilliant parents, so I don't know how much of that is genetic, how much of it is environment, but she can solve things, deduce things that is highly complex for her age. And she also has a physical intelligence. She was walking with her father down a very steep driveway, and she's not 2 yet. Normally they fall over when they lean into something. They're just learning how their body in space. She was dribbling, able to dribble the soccer ball just as she learned to walk. She doesn't fall down. It's remarkable to watch. And that's a form of intelligence. It's something that she just has, that's beyond what the statistically the children at that age, those milestones are further along in age than she has. She just has them. It's like Michael Jordan. Awareness of body and space is just a higher level than the average person statistically. That to me is just like the brain cells in the dish that organize. It's just a knowing that occurs it's a neurochemical electrical response that happens in a far more advanced fashion than in the average person. I don't know. You don't know why that is.
Well, until it's not average anymore, and more people are able to do it. And that's one of the reasons, like habit, I don't really differentiate. There's no good habit, bad habit. There's no multiple types of intelligence. There's one intelligence, but it will manifest itself as branches of a tree. And how it manifests could be different. Beethoven could write a symphony with a pencil and no eraser marks. So there's just some people that it flows a little bit better in certain areas. So intelligence.
Right, but he might walk out into the street without looking both ways. So it doesn't transfer across the board.
No, it doesn't. Not necessarily. So the intelligence factor is more of our ability to connect with one of the most innate aspects of the universe itself. Does that make sense? Any questions about intelligence? And, sometimes we do look at intelligence as, the body's intelligence or emotional intelligence, and those are just branches of the same thing. The different ways that will manifest. And so oftentimes I will, especially as we get towards the end of the system, you'll see a variety of triangles. And the idea with the triangle is that it will create a circle, and the circle is now a new object where there is no separation. There's no fine point in a circle. So that's kind of the image of symmetry. And this is just a way to organize things. So if you want, you can imagine this is a very, very large triangle for statistically the average mind, especially the one that is feeding the nemesis and is completely lost in thought and is engrossed in that human imbalance of too much thought, thinking all day long. Knowledge, wisdom, and intelligence gets further and further apart the more we feed the nemesis. Does that make sense? When they overlap, we can start to use our intelligence unto wisdom, our knowledge unto wisdom. They start to lend to one another. And then before you know it, there's no real separation between them. Does that make sense? And you are 100% more likely to remember things because.
Can you say that all again?
Sure.
So these three get further apart the more you feed the nemesis.
Absolutely. The nemesis pushes them apart.
And contrary to that, they overlap. Just say it in the opposite so my brain gets it.
The opposite, the triangle does get smaller. And at a certain point, you can just imagine that it starts to create a sphere. It starts to create a circle where there's no center point. There's no, on the side of a circle, there's no clear center point.
Because they're all existing in balance and simultaneously.
And simultaneously.
It's the hydrostasy factor.
It's the hydrostasy factor.
Okay.
Absolutely. And you find yourself in a situation and you're like, okay, something just doesn't feel right about this, and intuition is a form of intelligence. So we could look at that. It's the same intelligence. It's just manifesting itself as a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of wisdom. And so we would look at that as an intuitive, and sometimes it will come through as words too. Ernest, don't go down that alley. That looks dangerous. That feels dangerous, or there's something weird about this. So sometimes our brain will still translate it to words because it wants to organize. So it just wants to organize the information to keep you safe, not the end of the world. And sometimes it won't happen at all. Eventually, I think that most of us will be able to operate with our inner guru without a lot of words or any words at a certain point. I could see a future society, they just don't need the words. They just don't need to talk to themselves to organize it because intelligently it's going to organize itself no matter what. But that's okay if your brain does start to, again, we're not trying to banish all thought, right? So it's fine.
No, you need it in balance to know where balance is. So how can you adapt if you're not, we're in constant movement. So that is an always changing thing.
Yes. Yep. So the idea is that we create this sphere, and it will be the same. Like there's another triangle, and that one will have more to do with the get shit done factor. It will have more to do with behavioral change and hunting power. This is one that I decided to deliver in the beginning because the more that we do this practice, the less that we feed the nemesis, the more we are adaptable, the more that our mind is free to move. Therefore, our body will be more free to move. We'll have a pandemic, or we'll have a winter storm, or we'll have something that's highly inconvenient. and we'll adapt. We'll keep swimming. We'll maximize. We'll do what we need to do, and we'll get it done without a lot of extra psychological suffering. That is the intelligent thing to do, is it not? So I do also look at intelligence. It has a lot of different branches. And I do look at that as the evolution of consciousness as well. So I do look at music as a type of intelligence, our ability to perceive and you know, something's going on in our brain that's really musical, humor, imagination. And if it's done in a certain way, using your memory in the past, if it's done in a certain way. I would only start to talk about this stuff though after we've started to dissolve the nemesis. Because otherwise we'll end up just dwelling on the past again at the expense of the present. And that's not
Also with a connection to the infinite intelligence. It's a connection, the music, the art, the
that's what I
wind.
mean. That's well, and
Yeah,
one of the reasons we could look at that is because the human mind evolved. What does it evolve towards? Intelligence. We can do more. We can perceive more of infinity. So there'll be no end to that process necessarily. We'll just continue to perceive more and more and more. And there is a certain point that that's going to be beyond anything that you can imagine now, for the most part.
sure. And the expression of it is going to be more than we can imagine now because it's evolution. And so the expression of it will change just as it evolves.
Right. So knowledge, intelligence, and wisdom, the differentiation, I have never heard this anywhere else. I've never heard it organized like this. One of the reasons that it's organized the way that it is because of me doing the practice. And then it organizes itself for the most part. And I know that we just need different words to express what we're hoping to express. And these are the words that I've chosen. But the expression of them, I can, in air quotes, just see. And we'll talk about seeing much, much later. Does that make sense? So we do have two triangles. And when the two triangles are put together and you use them together, you get that hydrostasy sphere. And that is a complete game changer. Life is just completely different when these are in balance. Does that make sense? And it might not make as much sense because I haven't talked today about those other three. We don't talk about that until topic 19. So we'll talk more about that later. So for the most part, what we've learned so far is that there is a severe human imbalance. It exists primarily in, if not entirely, in the human mind, the human species attachment to language, which has led to thinking too much. And that imbalance has created a mind that is operating below the level of active recognition. It is thinking about the future, thinking about the past, comparing, contrasting, trying to figure it out, focusing on self and then other. And that is all just deep entrenched traps of thinking that create more patterns, create more habit. It makes a person less free to move, therefore less adaptable, therefore they're not evolving at a rate that they could be, sometimes de-evolving, meaning that they're going towards a state of decay, which is possible. So the idea then is that when we do this practice, and then so next week we'll start talking about techniques. We'll start getting into the practice. This is kind of what is this practice ultimately designed to do if we really get down to it. Yes, it alleviates almost all psychological suffering to a certain extent. You can feel sadness, and I wouldn't qualify it as suffering. You can feel certain types of physical pain, cognitive pain to a certain extent, and I wouldn't necessarily call it suffering. So I stub my toe, that doesn't necessarily lead to suffering, cognitive suffering. Physically, it just hurts. I'm not necessarily suffering. Does that make sense?
But the principles are the same.
Between
If
what?
I stub my toe in the morning and I feel like, oh crap, it's going to be a crappy day, and I'm thinking all day about how
Whoop, you muted yourself.
I'm suffering as much as sitting in the emergency room with a diverticulitis infection in my belly
Sure.
in level 8 pain. It's the same thing. It's the same. The principles are the same.
Mhm.
So there's no value really in comparing it.
Mhm.
I did the same practice that I in the emergency room as I would have done if I got up and stubbed my toe. The practice is the same. It's making the space and finding things to appreciate, and it's all the same principles. So it's still suffering. It's just the word that we use.
Mhm.
People want to compare whose suffering is bigger suffering than the other suffering.
Oh yeah, for sure. Uh, yeah, I remember those discussions back in the day when we had our a bigger group. Um, but ultimately, the idea is that this practice will address the human imbalance, and thought will start to find its proper place. We'll start to use thought in the most efficient way possible. And that will dissolve the nemesis, because this practice takes us above the level of active recognition. And there's always going to be below. Balance is the key. So we're always going to have below the level of recognition to a certain extent. Your reflexes will rely upon them. Your sense of proprioception goes beyond what you're currently recognizing. So we're always going to, so again, I'm not doing that weird thing that people do, and we go to an opposite extreme where we are always and forever above the level of recognition, and there is now no such thing as we're experiencing reality in fullness and totality. And it's like, what the hell? Like, what are you talking about? Like, do you even know? So the answer is no, usually when people are talking like that. So again, we're going to operate above and below. We're going to create new habit. Your brain does it. It wants to do it. It's designed to do it, and it's okay. But if we're above the level of recognition, we will have cognitive attention, behavioral attention, and we'll be able to feel whenever something is starting to get out of balance. Does that make sense? You've never eaten ice cream a day in your life. You try it when you're 50 and you're like, holy shit, this is amazing. I fucking love ice cream. And then you start eating ice cream every day. You are creating a new habit. And if you're doing it above the level of recognition, then you're going to see it and feel it when it starts to feel like too much. And you're like, whoa, 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 ice cream every day. I can feel it's adding up. I'm going to go ahead and use my hunting power techniques when we get there to moderate. It's important for your mind to understand moderation and not banishment, because the mind doesn't like that, especially if you're in a habit. You can't just tell your mind, oh, tomorrow we're not going to ever do this habit again. Your mind is like, well, what the fuck? I just put this habit together for you, and now you're banishing it. So we're learning to work with what we have, and no images of perfection, and no weird clinging to opposite extremes or anything like that. So we're addressing the human imbalance, which is too much thought. We're doing that with our practice and our techniques that take us above the level of recognition to where we can see our thoughts, we can see our behaviors, we can see our emotions. And now you'll start to understand why I use the word seeing. We start to recognize more in our environment. Energetically, we start to feel more in our environment. And that's all lending to the word that I call seeing. It's a cleaner lens of perception. And so when that happens, all of a sudden, our intelligence will start to work, and it will lend to knowledge and wisdom. Does that make sense? The act of remembering is a very intelligent thing. So the act of remembering itself is a form, is an expression. I don't want to say a form. A form of implies different forms of. Rather, I would like the word expression. It's a different expression. Memory, our ability to recall. And there's actually different ways to recall. There is the old school thought way that we love to use, but then there's something that I have started to call, at least for the psychologist's sake and the academic sake, emotional memory. But that's actually a different type of accessing memory. It's using different parts of your brain. I can assure you it is different. So emotional memory, and that's not always the best way to describe it, but it's definitely a way that the academic mind can get down with easier. They're like, oh, okay, so you're just in a form of state memory where you're able to recall previous states and previous feelings. Yes, but it's actually much more than that too. It's a completely different type of memory. So memory is always in a process, but the recalling and how it was processed is different than the way that we process and recall information. So recalling information and recalling previous experience, the emotional soup that you were creating, the vibrational patterns that you were creating, you can modulate to, you can match that and recreate it. Now, something that I won't teach because it's too far. We've gotten too far from the practice at that point. But I actually think the emotional memory, that type of memory, and I'm not even going to call it emotional memory at that point, we'll call it deliberate modulation, which is the ability to recall and change your vibrational state, can actually go to past your own life before you even physically existed as yourself. The fifth destroyer is the collective, and I do believe that the human being can access that. Again, that is not a part of the bridge mindfulness system. So you're on your own with stuff like that. Someday I'll talk about it in my books, but otherwise that's not something that I will ever teach. Just like most teachers of antiquity would never teach that sort of thing. They'll teach you techniques to open the mind, to open the gates, to open the doors, and then you have to walk through them. And as each person walks through them, we'll experience something different that is akin to our temperament, our interests, the totality of our understanding so far. So everybody will walk in that gate and through that gate, and it's more like a tunnel because you don't ever come out of it, but each person will be a little bit different. Donna was explaining a child who can do certain things, they would walk through that gate different than Beethoven's child, who just music, just they hear it, they know it, they understand it. It's just a sharper part of their intelligence. And the reason it's intelligence is because they didn't necessarily need knowledge, or which is personal experience or information or any of that. Does that make sense? And isn't it nice that we can use these words and they're not interchangeable? They have their own meanings. So even Eckhart, he was calling politicians stupid, but he was using intelligence and knowledge and wisdom all interchangeably. And I could tell Russell Brand had no real idea what he was talking about. Nobody really does. It kind of makes sense. And we're like, oh yeah, Eckhart, right. But then when we kind of break it down, it's like, whoa, I don't understand. This doesn't make any sense. Does that
He might be talking about the same thing, but he hasn't
we don't
taken the
know.
time to
Yeah.
define terms and make it transferable to anyone in any, yeah.
Exactly. It might make sense to him, but the communication factor for me, especially because I can see these individual words and their interplay, I'm like, that's the same thing that you're talking about with different words, and it's confusing. Not to me, but to anybody else wanting to learn from this, it's confusing. So that's why we're so deliberate with the specificity of our language. So we've addressed the human imbalance with our practice, and we're going to get into the practice even more as we go along, the essential aspects to the bridge mindfulness practice. I call the essential aspects cores, and the core is a pillar, a technique. So it's just a different way of explaining it. So the cores lend to gates. Gates lead to seeing. Seeing is a clear lens of perception where everything changes. The way that you view life, the way that you view existence, and very often it's difficult to express. It just depends. One of the things that maybe it's a part of my particular intelligence is I'm really good at putting things into words. I'm really good at organizing things and making sense out of things that before seemed all jumbled up. I don't know. That's a good example of intelligence because I've been doing it since I was a baby. Since I was a very little kid, I've been able to do this. I think about some of the things that are considered like woke ideology and all that jazz. These were thoughts that I was thinking way before that term existed, way before people were canceling Christmas. I was questioning it. I was like, hey, wait a second. Like, what are we really doing? Like, wait, who is this about again? Because mom, you never mentioned Jesus, like ever once. Like, what are we even doing here? What is Christmas about? Why is there so much waste? Why are people so angry? Like this, I saw that in the food industry. If you've ever worked in the food industry, you know that people during the Christmas season are at their worst. And when they're being cheerful, sometimes it's just complete fake. It's just like, you want to tell me off, but you're putting a smile on because you think it's Christmas and you need to be nice. And you can feel that inauthenticity. Does that make sense? And again, not everybody. Some people really, they love Christmas and they feel more cheerful. So everybody's a little bit different. But anybody working in food service will tell you that on average, people are much more stressed. They're much more edgy. They're trying to rush you much more because they're in a rush and they don't even know why. Got to get all of these gifts done before Christmas. We got to get the whole family together. The person who has to cook dinner for everybody every single year, they're putting their best face on, but it's like, it's just a mess to a certain extent. It can still be enjoyable to a certain extent. But my point is that I was questioning some of these very basic aspects of the human condition since I was a little kid, and I don't know why.
I don't know if I think that that's your absolute strength, because I was questioning all that stuff when I was like, why do people do that? Like, it just seemed, I don't know, the words and the reasons didn't match the feeling. And I knew that was accurate. Like, you're supposed to be the grown-up. Why do I see this and you don't see it? But the way that you can deconstruct it and reconstruct it and communicate it in an organized fashion is definitely an art. You have that lane of intelligence for some reason. The organization ability and to put it all out there and equate it, the micro to the macro, and seeing the principles in both and the trajectory. That's where the intelligence lies. The intelligence lies, in my opinion. I think it resonates with the people in the group, or they wouldn't keep coming, because we all understand the dynamics in ourselves and recognize it, and it resonates. So we keep coming back because it makes sense. But the organizational ability and the ability to communicate it and make it less complicated is definitely a skill and an art form.
And one of the reasons is because I need to be able to work with it myself. So yeah, the desire to work with these elements myself has always been there from one extent or another. The wisdom wasn't always there. So we'll just say that. But okay, so the human imbalance is too much thinking. It has gained generational momentum. It has led to the vast majority of the suffering of humankind, excuse me. It's not just a certain type of thinking, it's all thinking. All thinking is imbalanced because of the sheer proportion of it, the sheer volume of thought. That leads to the nemesis, where the human being is functioning almost entirely on habit, on patterns, and they're okay with that. And the mind starts to sink below the level of active recognition. And that's why we have a phrase called the present moment. That's why we have these words called mindfulness, because we have to bring the human mind back to the moment, back to where everything is happening. And that's why distraction is an enemy of knowledge, is because the best way to learn is to pay attention to the lessons, and the lessons are always happening now. Does that make sense? And so today we kind of talked about the universal factor of intelligence, that is an underlining of the fabric of the cosmos. The reason that a rock can take the form as a rock is because of fundamental intelligence on the smallest level. And then what happens? It combines into a planet. And if the planet's sentient in any way, well, then there you go. Intelligence on top of intelligence that lends to more intelligence, that leads to more evolution of life. Knowledge is something that intelligence can lend to, but They don't require one another necessarily. Now, typically intelligence can transfer to knowledge because you'll have an aha, you'll be able to do something, just like we were talking about my ability to organize things. That's an intelligent thing that has created more knowledge. So intelligence will lend to more knowledge, which can then lend to more wisdom, which then lends to more adaptability, more learning, more growth potential, and ultimately the evolutionary curve is sharper. And for anybody who says that evolution is benign, technically yes, but not to the species that's allowed to continue over time. So to the moth or the butterfly or the species that was able to adapt to its environment and it still exists, I think it would say that it was a very beneficial form of evolution. Does that make sense? But then again, to the butterfly that doesn't exist because of the change, it was not able to adapt. Yeah, so not so beneficial. So I would say that adaptation to change is a beneficial thing. But there are some who say, you know, categorically that it is benign. It's neither plus nor minus.
Beneficial to the Earth experience.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to exist, it's quite beneficial. If
Yeah,
exist,
on the planet,
yeah,
whatever existence is, that's a whole nother discussion.
it is. Yeah. Okay, so any questions about that? So next week we'll go into the first core of the practice, which is establishing presence. And that's bringing the mind back to the present moment so that we can start to develop more techniques, more tools that can help us to address the human imbalance of overthinking, which will also address the imbalance of the mind operating almost entirely below the level of active recognition, which feeds the destroyers. All of this making sense? Does it add up? And that's it. So that's the first three topics. We covered the human imbalance, and I'll do a little bit of review in each of these. That way it strings together a little bit better. I think by the time we get to topic 11, I'll probably stop mentioning the first 3 or 4 topics, but I'll still string it together in some way. So next week we talk about establishing presence because that's exactly the first step. First of all, it's the first step in the enemy of knowledge, which is distraction, because distraction and establishing presence are the antithesis of one another. So we address the human imbalance, which therefore addresses the nemesis, which therefore addresses the knowledge, intelligence, and wisdom triangle, bringing them closer together. And then they create a circle, a perfect sphere, and now all three are operating independently and together at the same time to create union, a type of wholeness. And before you know it, you're operating intelligently and you're operating with knowledge and wisdom. And the intelligence will continue to add to the knowledge bank, which will continue to add to the wisdom bank. And we can continue to grow as a society.
Human imbalance,
The human
operating below the level of recognition. And
which
what's
is
the
the
third?
nemesis. And the third is the 3 factors of knowledge,
Oh,
intelligence.
okay.
Yep. Which is what we discussed today. Knowledge does become an enemy of, or information becomes an enemy of knowledge. Wisdom and intelligence cannot. Intelligence can never be an enemy, ever. And neither can wisdom, because wisdom is acting on intelligence and knowledge. When you're transferring intelligence to wisdom, it's a lot like what we would have previously referred to as like flow state. Of course, now I say ebb and flow. I'm not going to just choose one over the other, but a more focused, balanced flow of just do energy. And ultimately, personal power. All of the triangle points.
Oh, I didn't know what you were saying. So knowledge can become a destroyer if it's imbalanced. Wisdom and intelligence cannot.
Right. The
I see
information
what you're saying.
specifically of knowledge. Knowledge can't be an enemy of knowledge. That doesn't make sense. But the information, if it's imbalanced in your knowledge equation of those 3
Can
things,
become a destroyer.
it can become
Yes.
an enemy of knowledge. I don't really refer to it as a destroyer just to keep them separate. But yeah, the destroyers are 5 of them. But information can become toxic. And we can have too much information that we don't remember, that doesn't lend to wisdom. And at that point, it's not intelligent. We can also look at intelligence as a type of efficiency. The way that the universe moves is efficient. It doesn't waste. It's geometrical in nature. Does that make sense? So if we're ever doing anything that's a waste of energy, or a waste of anything really, it's not the most intelligent course of action.
Yeah, but I'm not even gonna go there.
What?
Intelligence, like when you have there's a tendency to think that if somebody has a certain level of an ability, a certain ability in the intelligence as we define it, they have an innate ability to do something that makes them appear beyond the average person. I don't know how to say, make the words. It is common to assume that that transfers across other areas, and it doesn't. So that can be an imbalance. You know, people go, look how they're very smart. Look how well they do in whatever. They can you know, play a symphony, but they might be socially unable to deal with people. You know, it doesn't transfer across. So there can be an imbalance there. There's no imbalance in that specific lane that they excel in, because it's just an innate kind of thing. It's a collaborating with something beyond the finite, but it can be an imbalance to the being itself, that they don't necessarily have that level of expertise or ability in all other areas of intelligence.
Mm.
Do you know what I'm saying?
I do know what you're saying. Yeah.
And it could also make you want to only participate in that sphere because you have such confidence and ability in that sphere that you feel most comfortable there, because the rest of the things you're not as adept at. And it's an imbalance for the being sometimes.
It could be, but I still wouldn't say that that was intelligence fault. I would say that's more the person's fault. For whatever reason, you know, they're not transferring it to other aspects. And it may
There's
not.
no wisdom. They're not applying any wisdom
Right.
to the, yeah, I understand.
Yeah. And
on knowledge, you were talking about knowledge there and how it can become toxic.
information.
Information specifically. And I remember so well, just before we started these classes, reading and reading and reading, and my brain hurt, and thinking this idea was going to work, but just reading more and having this craving to get more books, self-help books, tons of them, and not one of them ever done anything because I didn't do anything with them.
Right.
But the knowledge, you know, accumulating all this knowledge and being able to talk about it, just it felt wrong because there was no change, there was no doing.
Right. And that's Facebook. That's what we see, and that's what I see so much in this spiritual realm. There's people that can drop paragraph on paragraph on paragraph about this, that, or the other thing, and I'm like, and what has any of this done for you? And it's the kind of the same thing when people are talking about their ancient masters, and I'm like, and you know what happened? They died. They're not immortal. Like, what did they fly? Like, what did they do that was just so awesome that we need to recreate everything that they did the way that they did it? Like, what are you hoping to achieve?
Yeah,
So,
it's still the habit belief that the more information, more school we go to, and the more information we obtain, the smarter we are and the better we function. And that's not necessarily so. You can be way out of balance with information until it becomes toxic. Like Ida said, her brain hurt from trying to read all of this stuff because our deductive reasoning has caused us, and our habit and momentum as a society has caused us to think, well, if I can just get more information about this, then I'll be better at it. And it's not the only factor in wisdom.
right. And then also experience chasing. Sometimes people think that they need to experience everything to understand it. And so that can also turn into an imbalance.
The bucket list. I
Yeah.
need to travel to more places, and not that there's not value in travel, but it's what you do with the experience that is valuable, not necessarily inherent in the place that you visited.
I'm
It's
not,
just,
yeah, I'm not a tourist. I don't, it's just a personal thing. It has nothing to do with the class, but I don't find as much value in just looking at something and being like, oh, there's that. Let's on to the next
there
thing.
are people that world travel that aren't just tourists. They're really interested
Yeah.
in cultures and
Yeah.
learning how other people think for different perspectives, and it is valuable.
It is.
But it's not necessary, but it is valuable.
Yeah. And so I'm
I
not
feel
a
a
tourist.
very strong impulse. Sorry for interrupting. I feel a very strong impulse to inhabit the environment that you're in and to get to know every corner of it, the environment that you're living in,
Yeah.
to honor it, to have lived a real life in the place where you live.
Right. That
To
was
me, feels important somehow.
I think that's important to me too. One of the principles that Shayna and I have is that if we want to move, we still have to absolutely love where we're at. If we want to move to Colorado, it's not because we want to get away. We love where we're at. There's no issues with where we're at. But, every now and then you feel the need to or the desire to experience something a little bit different for whatever reason. Yeah, and so everybody will be a little bit different in all of those regards. I just see the folly or the flaw in tourism and what it creates on an economic level, and it continues to do certain things that I just don't align with personally. So, yeah,
I just think it's an extreme, like everything else that happens in the culture, is that traveling can give you a sense of, it can have value. But once it turns into tourism instead of traveling, then it becomes something else that's very commercial and contrived, and it loses value. Yeah.
and like Ida said, when I just look at something, I don't feel like I've honored it. I don't feel like I've really experienced it just because I got a picture of me in front of, the Taj Mahal. It's like, and I mean, yeah. So I'm a little bit different in that regard, that if I did travel somewhere, I want to spend some time there. I want to keep going back to that place to get to know it better and better and better. And then maybe move on to somewhere else. I don't know, but then maybe not. Maybe just settle in that area and explore every nook and cranny of it. That's fine too. So the freedom is in not needing, so to travel or to not travel for me is the same. Maybe sometimes I have the desire to, but it's not an imbalance. I don't feel that I absolutely have to, or my DNA is going to unravel. And that's how people get. They're like, oh my God, I need to travel. I just need to go luxury, yada, yada, yada. I'm not into any of that. I don't need any of that. I do prefer places to be clean as opposed to filthy and dirty, but as long as it's clean, it doesn't have to be modern. It doesn't have to be updated. I don't care about any of that. As long as there's not spiders crawling across my face the next day. And even if there are, I'll adapt to that, but I won't prefer it. That will never be preferred. Okay, so that's what we have for today. We have strung those together. We've created that first little triangle. Eventually, through doing this practice, that triangle starts to move in a manner of speaking, and they get closer together and they start to operate simultaneously. So we can operate intelligently with knowledge and wisdom all at the same time. And then that is a real great way to be free to move both physically and psychologically, which free to move leads to adaptation, leads to the sixth core, which is the act of alignment, or because we're aligned with the present moment, we're not fighting it, we're not denying it, we are able to move with it. We're able to change with change. And I will give techniques for that when the time comes. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Well, on Thursday, we have our regular group study. So if you have questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to bring them. When I'm done with these 20 topics, I don't know if we'll do anything on Tuesday. Probably just go to Thursday, give Donna an opportunity to teach, or somebody else an opportunity if they want to. You can share it, try to get more folks in. If we're doing beginner stuff, that's all fine too. But yeah. So we'll see you again on Thursday if you can make it. I'll post this video. I just posted Thursday's class to YouTube, so I'll post this one to YouTube as well so folks can review it. But this will be the 20 essential teachings that I have, and then I'm done. That's pretty much all I have to share in that regard. I'll continue to do other things. I'm sharpening up some of my physical practices, and that's all going to be great. And I'm really surfing the end of this practice. So I'm really going through that tunnel, that gate that I talk about. So my practice is incredibly important to me. It has to be pristine. It has to be vivid. I can't just be that guy that's just talking all the time. It just wouldn't work for me. There's just no universe that I see that being acceptable for me. It's cherry picking. So much like Thich Nhat Hanh, I'll talk a little bit, but then if you want to know, you got to come walk with me. I'm not going to keep talking. Okay. All right. Well, I'll see everyone Thursday. Thanks for hanging out. And if you have questions, comments, concerns, just let me know. All right.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Yep. You're welcome. See ya.
Bye.
Bye.